Thank you. Okay. All right. We had this great weather and a nice crowd, and we're going to go down memory lane with history and headstones. Welcome. As a continuation of the celebration of the town of Maine's 175th anniversary, Nanticoke Valley Historical Society is presenting History in the Headstones Pioneer Edition. I'm Sue Lisk, Town of Maine historian, and I'm honored to welcome you all to the Maine Cemetery. The Maine Cemetery was first started in a lot by the Congregational Church Society of Maine, where their church was once standing. Today there are 3,795 people buried here, but the first burial was the body of Grove Slauson on April 14th, 1816. He was 8 months old when he died. In March 17th, 1836, the property became the Maine Cemetery Corporation, and more land was added to this large cemetery it is today. Join us as we step back in time to a place where voices of the past will give us a reflection of times gone by and a perspective of life as it was for our first pioneer citizens in the Nanticoke Valley. Now let's imagine what the pioneers may have seen when they first arrived in this beautiful valley. Thank you.
My name is Sarah Bowles Baldwin. I was a local Maine girl at the time of this telling, and I'm married to Henry Baldwin, who was a local farmer from Nanticoke. We appreciate very much you taking an interest in learning of ourselves and our family. This is Rusty, our quote-unquote farm dog.
Neither the Bowles nor the Baldwins were among the very first of the settlers in the Nanticoke Valley, but they weren't far behind them. And in fact, the Baldwins, having bought land in 1793 in Nanticoke, were among the very first to own land that they later settled on. Sarah introduced me as Henry, and on the stone it reads Levi Henry Baldwin, and that is my name, but as a boy growing up in central Massachusetts in Spencer, I was born in 1832, I soon came to be known as Henry to distinguish me from both my father and my grandfather, who were both Levis, and then later on in life in Nanticoke to distinguish me from a fourth generation Levi, a nephew. When this land first opened up, this area first opened up for settlement on the heels of the Clinton and Sullivan expedition and the Boston Purchase, my grandfather, who was a Revolutionary War veteran, and a farmer in Spencer, Massachusetts, bought lot number 289 in the Boston Purchase, the grand division of the Boston Purchase. If you can picture downtown Nanticoke, and I don't know how many might, lot 289 is the first lot north of downtown Nanticoke. At just about the break of the hill beyond Nanticoke, lot 289 begins. As a kid, I heard stories of families from Spencer in the area that were moving out to New York. We had quite a few from Spencer who came to Nanticoke, in fact. And I also heard stories of my father coming out and clearing the land and getting the property ready for the family to move out. His sister, Sarah, and her husband, Nicholas Morgan, had already came out early and settled early on the northern half of lot 289, and they've left a number of descendants in the area. And when we came out here, we were on the southern part of the lot. But my father, when he was clearing the land out here, he wrote letters back telling about his experiences. And one neat story that he told was that he hired a logging crew of 2 men that he paid for with axes, explaining that axes were more valuable to him than money was, and in fact asking that the family would send more axes out. He told of burning trees and planting crops, which at that point he was planting potatoes and peas, but he also had in the ground some buckwheat and timothy and flax, in fact. We actually didn't move out until 1847, and we came in February, and I guess the reason for that was so that the marshy land was firmer that we could travel over than we would have been able to. We came over the Berkshire Hills, we crossed the Hudson's River, we followed the Catskill Turnpike as far as that came, and landed here in Nanticoke. We weren't able to bring all that much with us, as you can imagine, but we did pack away some things that were very important to the family. We brought my great-grandfather's desk. We brought a cradle that my grandparents used to rock my father in when he was a little baby. And we brought my dad's Bible, which was old even then, that he read from to the family every night, every single night. He being a major in the Massachusetts militia, we also brought a number of items that related to his service in the militia, most notably maybe a helmet, or shako as he called it, and a dress sword. The Baldwins, as I explained, settled on the southern part of 289. Again, the Morgans, my grandfather's sister and her husband, had already settled on the north part. Soon after we came out here, my oldest brother, I was the middle of 3 boys. There were no girls, middle of 3 boys. My oldest brother, Charles, died in 1851 at age 20. He had established himself already as a shoemaker in town, but unfortunately died, and he was one of the first buried in that cemetery on the hill the other side of Nanticoke. I ended up moving to the western part of the farm on the road that leads from Nanticoke up to Cadwell Settlement, built a house, some barns, and through the years added onto that farm. My younger brother Albert stayed on the homestead, which was on the road that went from Nanticoke over to Whitney Point, up the hill that you might now know as Cherry Valley Hill Road. In due time, my interest was pointing south towards Maine.
You might say I caught his eye. And then I caught Henry. And in what was it, Henry? Seems like only yesterday.
1858.
1858, we were married. But I get ahead of myself. I was born in Vermont in 1839. I got that one. My dad, Freeman Bowles, and my mom,
Harriet Reed?
Harriet Reed. I'm talking about my real grandmother. Nettie Reed and my grandfather, Nicholas Freeman, came to decide to leave Vermont and come to New York when I was only an infant. We settled in Maine. My dad was a farmer, and he had several properties in Maine but his farm was on the outskirts up on Lewis Street. My grandpa was what they called a mechanic, meaning a carpenter, and we had a home right in downtown Maine, which is now part of the church, and it's now called somebody's annex.
The Zimmer Annex.
The Zimmer Annex house. My three sisters were all born here in Maine.
Where are they? Your folks buried?
My folks, yes, I'm glad you brought that up. My folks are buried also in this cemetery over near Isaac Lamb.
Okay. Well, before long, the Civil War broke out, 1861. At that point, I was 28 years old, recently married, had a little baby girl, and the last thing I wanted to do was go south and fight. So I stayed put. But 2 years later, the Draft Act was approved. And my younger brother, Albert, over on the eastern part of the farm, he was younger, but at that point, he was married and had a little girl. So we had a tough decision to make, and I suspect people second-guessed us at the time, and I suspect people might still second-guess us, but we took advantage of a provision of that act that allowed you to pay $300 to the government or to a substitute to get an exemption from service, and that's exactly what the two of us did.
Don't apologize for that, Henry. After all, very few actually were drafted, and the money was much needed for the war effort. I didn't have any brothers, so I didn't have that worry about whether they were going to serve, but I'm very grateful that Henry was home with our children.
The Baldwin family is very active in their new community. My father, Major Levi, chaired the meeting when the Baptist Church was first organized in 1852. Actually organized as the first Baptist and Congregational Society of West Nanticoke. What you hear of as Lamb's Corners, named after Isaac Lamb, locally, but after he died, there was interest. He died in 1845. There was interest in what are we going to call it? Why are we calling this place Lamb's Corners? Ultimately, it became known as Nanticoke when they changed the name of the post office. But the organizations in town generally were labeled West Nanticoke. But he also was active in Masonic Lodge. He was a charter member of the Masonic Lodge over in Sentinel Isle, a very early lodge. But he transferred his membership to the main lodge here after I joined down here and became an active member of that lodge. We also were very involved in especially farm organizations like the Grange and the Egg Society and the fair in town that we hosted for a number of years that the Egg Society hosted. Sarah and I had two children, both daughters. The oldest, Mary, is buried here. You see her name on the stone, one of the stones in front of us. She was married twice, first to a Smith and then to a Haight. The name on her footstone reads Mary L. Haight. That was her name when she died. Next to her is Scott Smith. That's the only child from the first marriage, her Smith marriage, and he died fairly young in 1913 and is buried here. Having two daughters and neither of them staying in the Nanticoke Valley, our other daughter married a guy from Whitney Point and is buried over there. We have no descendants in the Nanticoke Valley today. Any of those who are Baldwins living in the valley today are descendants of my younger brother, Albert, who stayed over on the homestead. And in fact, today there are three generations in Baldwins living in Nanticoke, the youngest of which represent the seventh generation of Baldwin that have called Nanticoke home. My father died in 1876. My mother in 1888. They're buried up on the hill in Nanticoke, frankly, where I always thought I would be buried. I died in 1907. Sarah followed me 2 years later in 1909. And now, more than a century later, here we are at peace and at home in Maine.
Thank you very much for coming to hear our story of our family and ourselves. I want you to remember that as you drive by this beautiful Baldwin monument, it represents a very prosperous farmer from Nanticoke falling in love with a Maine town girl.
I did all right.
Are there any questions for Henry?
Any questions for Sue?
I'm hoping I would know the answer.
Henry, Levi Henry here was my father's great uncle. So he's my great great uncle. And there's another great granddaughter holding the dog there, or trying to hold him, Joyce Baldwin. Okay, good. Thank you.
I see somebody that's kind of lurking behind me here, a Captain Gardner Saywin Bowers of the Bowers family. Do you have anything to tell us today?
Well, I'm not sure I know how to use this fangled thing. Can everybody hear me?
No.
I was afraid you were going to say that.
We got cars.
Because I do have a tendency to walk back and forth. So, okay. Anyway. Yeah. Now, you all good folks, I take it, have come to see the fine Bowers Family Monument. My wife and I are buried there along with a few others. But every now and then, time for time, I really enjoy coming back to the hamlet of Maine. So with that, I suppose I ought to introduce myself. Gardner Selwyn Bauer. I'm the youngest son of Nehemiah Bauer II from Boston. He was he was a Revolutionary War veteran, a Minuteman at both Lexington and Bunker Hill. Now, I was the first of my family to make the journey from Rindage, New Hampshire to Broome County in 1822. I bought property down here. And I'll have to say I met and fell in love and married the young lady next door by the name of Akshar Taylor. We got married in 1827. Had 6 children in the farmhouse. We settled up at Bowers Corners, about a mile up north of the village of Maine. And then in 1871, our farmhouse burnt down. So we built the homestead. And the homestead is what you see today up north of town. By trade, I was a millwright by trade. So that gave me the opportunity to clear the farmland, clear the land for the farm and for the houses for the settlers to come in. For many years, I was the town magistrate for the township of Maine. Now, you heard him say this is Captain Bowers. Well, I got Captain Bowers. I was commissioned into the New York State militia by Governor DeWitt Clinton and Marcy in what they called the training days. That was from about 1829 to mid-1830s. Well, in 1861, I was commissioned again to raise troops for the Civil War. I do feel bad if people are standing out in the sunshine. I wish there was a little more shade for you, but well, I do believe that some people will say, you know, you've led a pretty interesting and notable life. But I'm not sure that that's, I think we all feel that sometimes when we're there. But I will say one thing, I have taken enough of your time already. So I will bid you a fine farewell.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So here is another of our settlers, Lyman Pollard. Well, he's here to tell you all about his interesting life.
The Nanticoke Valley has gone through many changes since early settlers first came here. I am one of them. Allow me to introduce myself. I am Lyman Pollard. In 1809, I came here from New Hampshire to start my business career in the Nanticoke Valley. I bought a farm east of Main Village up on top of what is now called Pollard Hill. And I built a house up there. My brother-in-law, John Durfee, who is buried nearby, built a sawmill southeast on the Nanticoke Creek, which I ran for a number of years. I frequently ran 30 to 40 rafts of logs down the Susquehanna River every season, eventually including my son in the business as Pollard and Son Sawmill. I had previously been a pilot on the river. Now, in 1847, I built a shop on the corner of Church and Main Streets. When the town in 1848 was included and became the town of Maine, I was named Pound Master. Eventually, I helped found the Merchants National Bank of Binghamton. As the years passed, I married Adelia and raised a wonderful family. I included many activities in my life before I passed away in 1876. I guess you could say I became a successful businessman and leading citizen in the town of Maine.
All right. Well, now we're here in this nice, cool place under this tree that's shading us all. And I wanted to introduce you to Thomas Marine and his wife, Esther Patterson Marine. Thomas?
It's funny how time passes so quickly in the Nanticoke Valley. Feels just like when we died in 1829. I am Thomas Marine, and this is my wife, Esther Patterson Marine. These are our stones. These are our stones, and they're not really looking so well after this long time.
Thomas and I were born and grew up in Watertown, Massachusetts in the 1750s.
But it's really the fight for American independence that tells our story.
Thomas and my brother fought together during the Revolution.
Yes. As well as Aaron Delano and Daniel Slossom. I remember back in October of 1776. We were camped pretty close to the British troops. We snuck down to the meadows and stole a horse from them. We rode it safely back to camp.
Thomas and I married after the war ended, and my brother Amos, who was a part of the 11, which later enlarged to 60, went on to form a company who would later purchase the land known as the Boston Purchase, and we proceeded to live on that land.
That's how we became the very first settlers of Broome County and later settled in the town of Maine.
Thank you.
Thank you.
How are you? I am your great granddaughter, and I live here in the town of Maine. And so that makes me 7th generation from your moving here. And my goodness, it goes on. There's 10 generations that live here in the town of Maine. Oh my. And Esther, your property from your family over in Endwell, it covered from the Susquehanna River clear back beyond the IBM golf course. And then it was split up. What's left is the housing building, which lo and behold, I ended up living next to the neighbor on marine property, and he used to live in your old house on the Susquehanna, so we had lots to talk about. And for a while, the ships and boats that came up the Susquehanna used your place as a hotel. Oh my goodness. Then we get to Maine, which is where my grandparents go from Lee and Gertie, and they always tried to call her Gertrude, and her name is Gertie, lived here. And then there was Fred and Martha, who also lived on Main Street, right in the town of Maine. Oh my. And then we had relatives in Glen Aubrey, all from you two. There are so many I can't count. I have a book over here that's page after page of the Marines and Pattersons. Very interesting reading. So I am so glad to meet you after all these years.
We have a lot of hams here in the town of Maine. And this is Bev Clark, our dear member of the Historical Society. And we all know she's a Marine. So, thank you. So, do you have any other questions, or are there any other Marines in the audience that would like to talk to your relatives? All right, well then we're going to go see Isaac Lamb this is a grand finale. We're going to go see Isaac Lamb. Now, this is our last person that's going to tell us all of about his fascinating story. And I want you to all welcome, I was going to say Yancey, Isaac Lamb, who also had an interesting story.
Excuse me, Mrs. Lisk, but it is Isaac Thomas Lamb, not to be confused with my father, who is Isaac Lamb, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that as I read through the script here. Wow. When we picked this spot out as our final resting place, we were in the far back of the cemetery. Now, look at all the new stones around us and behind us. Makes me think how much the Nanticoke Valley changed over the years after my parents came to town. I'm Isaac Thomas Lamb. Don't forget the Thomas part, or you'll confuse me with my dad, who was also Isaac. When my folks came to the Nanticoke Valley from Dutchess County, there weren't many people in the area. Judd Dudley had settled here near the cemetery. Ben Norton had settled in what we now call Bowers Corners, on the north side of the main village. And the Gates brothers, Russell and Alfred, had settled a few miles up the west branch of the Nanticoke Creek, at what would become known as Gates Settlement. My dad continued another 2 or 3 miles up the creek in 1804 to the spot that came to be called Lamb's Corners, recognizing my folks as the first settlers in the western part of what is now the town of Nanticoke. This parcel my dad cleared and farmed and was the southern half of Lot 271 in the Boston Purchase. As other families moved into the town, including the Smiths, who settled on the north half of Lot 271, my dad developed mills on the creek, both a sawmill and a grist mill. My folks, Isaac and Lydia Peasley Lamb, had a large family. I was the youngest, born in 1817. I farmed right there at Lamb's Corners. Some of my brothers and sisters stayed in the area, but a number of them moved to Illinois. Dad died in 1845 and Mom in 1846. Both are buried in the Tyona Cemetery on Ashley Road. Unfortunately, they did not live to see Lamb's Corners blossom in the years that followed into the thriving community that it was. In the decades after Dad died, 2 churches and a school were built in the hamlet. And before long, Lamb's Corners was boasting of another mill, its own cemetery, 2 stores, a creamery, a fairground, a grange, a dance hall, and more. Even its own newspaper, the Lamb's Corner Eagles, and the Lamb's Corner Post Office. We did lose our name on the post office when in 1892 the office was renamed Nanticoke. I married Sarah Ann Smith in 1842. We lived for a while on the family homestead at the Corners, but later moved into the Smith house on Rabbit Path, and we had 4 kids. Marabath married George C. Bush. They farmed in Nanticoke and then relocated to Newark Valley. Ellen married Andrew Church. They lived in Maine, where Andrew had a drugstore and then relocated to Binghamton. Charles operated the William Dyer store here and lived on McGregor Ave. He died in 1896 at 38 years old. This is actually his stone that we are standing next to. Edwin married Helen Pollard, daughter of William C. Pollard and Emma Jane Durfee, both from the early Maine families. She died in 1863, shortly after my grandson, Erford, was born. Erford was then raised by his grandmother, Pollard, and the 2 are buried nearby, right over behind us to my left. Edwin worked in his brother-in-law's drugstore here in Maine, but remarried and later lived in Syracuse. As we got older, we sold the farm to Levi Tyler Baldwin and moved here to Maine. I died in 1890, Sarah in 1907. We're buried right here with Charles. Thank you.